Welcome to Back to School, a podcast where two highly opinionated design system consultants put aside their deep set assumptions to dive deep on design systems topics. Climb aboard the school bus for a field trip on the history, the lessons, and the people that really make a design system truly great. Yes, I did it! Wasn't that great? Wasn't that the best intro I've ever done?
That was the best intro, leaving the best to
Talk
last.
about ending on a high.
It's our last episode, Amy Hupe. I feel like we've come a long way in the past 6 months.
We
Is
really
the
have, Geri.
one thing that you've learned making this podcast that you will take away?
I read this question in your notes and I was racking my brain for anything that wasn't capybara related, because that is I've learned more about capybaras than I ever imagined I would.
Me too.
But yeah, I was kind of reflecting on the series and what we've talked about, and I don't know that I've necessarily learned anything that's brand new that as a kind of takeaway that will stay with me. But something that recording the podcast has definitely reaffirmed for me is the importance of investment in design systems, because I think what we've seen through the series, we've talked a lot about different design systems at different organizations and what they're doing and what they're able to kind of produce and how they operate. And something that's really struck me, and I don't know about you, is this huge, vast difference between teams who have good funding and who are kind of slightly bigger, more stable teams, compared with teams who perhaps don't have as much funding and are having to do a lot of the work kind of side of desk. So that, I think, has been my biggest takeaway. It was something that I kind of believed before, but I perhaps had this quite optimistic view that, you know, you can still do really good design systems work without necessarily a huge amount of funding and financing. And now I take it all back. Not true. Fund your design systems or go home. It's my takeaway.
And senior stakeholder buy-in as well, and support, and someone to champion you higher up is also key. Otherwise, it's not going to fly.
Absolutely not going to fly.
That's a cheery note to start on. In terms of what I've learned, I've stopped saying like and you know quite so much, largely because I've got a post-it on my screen that says, instead of saying you know, just shut the F up. I've learned how to speak into a microphone as well, so people can hear me consistently, but I do still have a New Zealand accent. I suppose you can't have everything.
Not much we can do about that.
I've also learned we have very different organisation styles. I write my notes well in advance. You write yours on the day.
Oh, come on. Only on the day. That only happened once. But I know I do. I leave it quite close to the deadline. It's how I always did my homework, Geri. It's because we're going back to school. I've regressed to my former childhood self.
Highly relevant. Well, that circles us around to our episode today, our final episode on accessibility. I thought we should do an episode on accessibility. It's close to my heart. After 8 years at the design system coalface, I now have a dedicated accessibility role. So all those skills learned on the design system are highly transferable. You know, I'm now that person that appears in designers' Figma files and completely traumatizes them as the sort of color contrast and semantics police. As Amy said, we are going back to school. We've got a back to basics approach. If you are starting out and you're tasked with making your design system accessible but don't know where to start, this is one for you. If you are already eating WCAG criteria for breakfast, just stick around for Amy's quality bants.
What do you mean, Geri? Are you saying that I'm not bringing lots of subject matter knowledge to the table today?
Just one caveat before we start. When we're talking about accessibility, we mean digital accessibility. So making sure your websites and apps are designed and coded so they can be used by disabled people or any people using your product. So we're starting off, as we often do, with a history lesson. When did you start thinking about accessibility as a thing to consider when making websites?
Good question, Geri. So I guess the first time that I actually was at all involved in the process of making websites, as it were, rather than just writing content to be published on them, was when I went to work for GDS, which was in 2017. And I couldn't really have had a better introduction to accessibility and the web, because that's a huge focus at GDS and a huge part of the kind of culture and one of the kind of core values of what they do. I think one of their design principles is this is for everyone, and there's very much kind of practice what they preach in terms of making sure things are very accessible. So that was really when I started to kind of become engaged with the subject. And then I've tried to kind of continue what I learned there throughout my career at various different places with varying degrees of success.
It's really interesting how recent this is. Looking way back, I did UAL, University of the Arts London's first degree in digital design, like the first year they ran it. I graduated in like 2003, which is probably before you were born, Amy. But curiously, the course never once talked about or alluded to accessibility or the idea that disabled people or anyone with an impairment might use the web. I mean, there were undoubtedly just as many disabled people using the web back then. And it's kind of incredible to me looking back that this wasn't taught to us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do think there's a real kind of question about this in terms of, and I don't know how much the situation has improved today. You know, I don't know how much it is part of the curriculum on kind of digital learning. God, see, this is what I mean about the COVID. I myself have an impairment today because I cannot join up my brain with my mouth. But yeah, I don't know how much things have improved today. I don't know whether it is incorporated as part of university courses or teaching at school or anything like that, compared with what it was in 2003, when in fact, Geri, I was 14 years old. So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
I think it was certainly, it's certainly covered at university level now. I don't know about at school computing. I actually spoke to a UX undergrad cohort at Reading University about design systems, and they specifically asked me to talk about accessibility. This was last year. So okay. I'm hoping it is now on the agenda for a degree.
Or did they ask you to talk about it because it isn't? They were like, just tell us something.
Yeah, I'd like to think that it is. It's certainly becoming much more of a requirement now on, general things like job specs for product designers, for engineers. I think, even 5 years ago, there wouldn't have been a requirement. Now, when I'm interviewing product designers, it's certainly something I'd cover. So it's something that you need to cover, and is a really useful skill, and will only become more useful to you, I think.
Absolutely.
Anyway, bit of a digression. We were talking about history. So in terms of history, there's been some key milestones for accessibility. The main ones have been laws and standards introduced over the past 30 years. Starting with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. It became law in 1990. And in 1996, the Department of Justice clarified that websites were public accommodations, and webmasters, this was the 1990s, had a legal obligation to make sure they were accessible. The US also has the Rehabilitation Act, which mandates that all federal agencies or government sites need to be accessible. And in 1998, Section 508 of that act was amended to include accessibility standards. So 2 big hitting laws in the US, which have kind of shaped all the legal stuff going forward in history. We then, of course, have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. WCAG 1 was published in 1999 and was kind of limited, but, it started to set out the basic standards to pave a way for a more accessible internet. As a total segue here, why does everything accessibility related have an acronym when acronyms are like the least accessible language construct? As a master of language, Amy Hupe, how do you feel about things like ADA and WCAG?
Now, I'm going to surprise you here, Geri, and say that I don't mind them.
Really?
So I don't, yeah, because I mean, in general, I think acronyms need to be used very sparingly and considerately. I think that there are times where acronyms are incredibly exclusionary. So if you just joined an organization, we've all been there, and they're throwing around all these acronyms and you really don't know what any of them mean, and nobody is explaining that to you. That's obviously not a good thing. But I think that when it comes to accessibility related acronyms like A11Y or Ali, some people say, or WCAG, or ADA. I think that for a start, I think that a lot of these acronyms started being used widely on Twitter, where we originally had a very kind of small character count that we had to work within. And it allowed us to talk about these things publicly using this kind of shorthand. The other thing is, and I actually wrote a blog post on my website a long time ago about this called The Case for Jargon. And I think that the interesting thing about kind of acronyms is that whilst they are exclusionary, perhaps to people who don't know about those things, they are inclusive for the people who do understand them. And they can help to signify that you are kind of part of a community who is impassioned and who understands this stuff. Eric Bailey actually wrote a really interesting blog post on A11Y specifically, the numeronym. I always mess up that word, but I think I said it right then. And kind of wrote a defense of it and basically said that it kind of helped for him when he's looking up accessibility related content. It helps him to kind of shortcut his way to much more specific content from people who he knows are likely to be kind of sharing his values and trusted and knowledgeable about the subject. It's also not really that hard to Google. You know, if you Google A11Y or WCAG, you'll get results pretty quickly telling you what they are. I do advocate writing the term out in full the first time you use it. So if you're writing some documentation, do your readers the courtesy of writing out web content accessibility guidelines at the first reference. But I don't really mind them. I think that they're quite helpful for kind of signaling that you're, you know, part of a community, and and brevity.
That was a very eloquent reply for someone whose brain's not working today.
Thank you.
Just to circle back around to the chat, Ali has actually posted in shout out to Loughborough Design School. They ran several classes on accessibility when I was there.
Oh, that's reassuring to hear. We've also got Michael in the chat reminding us that WCAG and ADA are initialisms, not acronyms. Are they? I mean, when I say WCAG, is that not an acronym? Because I'm saying it like a word.
Oh.
And ADA, I'm saying it like a word. Doesn't that make it an acronym? Don't know. I genuinely don't know. But
let's take it offline.
Initialisms or acronyms. Let's take it offline. This is not good podcast content. I'll give you some of the best we've done.
I wish I hadn't driven my segue in here. Back to history class. Okay. Yes. So WCAG 2 was released in 2008 with criteria that was more testable by humans and automation. We then obviously had WCAG 2.1, WCAG 2.2 finally released last year. And some of the most important milestones in recent accessibility history have been rulings on lawsuits. There were, I Googled this, 2,314 ADA-based lawsuits in 2018. How many do you think there were last year?
Oh, it's really interesting because I'm hoping that we've got a little bit better in that time at web accessibility, but we also might have become more litigious with the laws. So I'm going to assume we sued more people over this, and I'm going to go 3,500.
4,220, so nearly double in 4 years. So there's along with the financial penalties, the main downsides for companies are obviously reputational damage. You know, there's been some kind of high profile cases in the States against was Target and Domino's Pizza. Media fallout from those was both huge. So
I remember the Domino's fiasco. I don't use Domino's anymore. Papa John's all the way for me.
Okay, you heard it here. So do you think people's understanding and appreciation of the importance of accessibility has improved in the time that you've been working in design systems? It sounds like you have.
I'd say so, yeah. I'd say there's definitely more awareness. I think it's easy sometimes to become frustrated by seeing the same issues kind of coming up over and over again. But I do definitely just personally see people talking more about accessibility now and kind of talking about it more like a kind of default expectation rather than something that they have to address later or something they're going to deprioritize for now. It seems like something that a lot of the people that I've been lucky enough to work with consider it to be a non-negotiable. I think it's changed. It is hard. It is sort of hard for me to assess though as well, because as I sort of mentioned, I did start my digital career at GDS, where obviously kind of knowledge and care about accessibility was fairly ubiquitous as part of the culture. So I don't know, but I think it's improved. What would you say?
I think it's definitely improved. I mean, I feel like with COVID, so many face-to-face interactions were suddenly expected to take place online, which I think really raised the profile for accessibility as like a fundamental human right. You know, you can't expect people with a disability or impairment to work remotely without providing accessible digital products and services. So I think that's had the knock-on effect. Yeah, you know, young designers and engineers seem a lot more engaged, companies seem a lot more engaged. So yeah, I feel like we're in a better place than when I first started in systems.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Let's move on. That was just a general bit of accessibility history. Let's get back on track to applying this to a design system, which is what this podcast is all about. So where do you start with accessibility on a design system? I often get messages from people saying, it's suddenly my job as a designer or an engineer to make our design system accessible. Help, where do I start? So to rinse the school metaphor, I'm calling this section biology class or understanding humans. And I'm starting with learn how disabled people use the web. For me as a designer, the starting point for accessibility has always been to learn how disabled people use the web and use your product. Have you ever been involved in user testing with disabled users or people with access needs?
Yeah, I have. Again, sort of mainly at GDS. It was something we did quite a lot of around the GovUK design system. So we had a kind of a big audit. We had lots of our products tested by DAC, the Digital Accessibility Centre, and they're super helpful, actually. They send videos through of people kind of using your products and things, so you can actually really get a sense of the issues that they're facing and some of the barriers that they're facing in this quite first-hand way, rather than having to just read a quite a dense report and not necessarily seeing the human side of it. In other kind of jobs that I've worked on, we have sort of what is the past tense of strive? Is it strove or striven?
Strove. We have striven.
We have striven to include.
We endeavoured.
Perfect.
Nice.
We tried to include disabled people in our testing with varying degrees of kind of success. There is sometimes challenges around recruiting disabled participants for user research, as I'm sure you've encountered. But yes, I have been lucky enough to be kind of involved in user research and user testing with disabled people at various points in my career. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, similarly worked with the Digital Accessibility Centre down in Neath when I was at Lloyd's. They're a fantastic group of people. If you ever need an audit done or need some accessibility advice, you know, you can go down and visit them and, you know, see all of their testers testing your site. I learned so much from them, and with other consultancies as well, as I've, you know, that I've worked with over the years. Not all companies have the budget or scope for user testing with disabled people, though. But I found you can learn a lot from watching people use assistive tools on YouTube. If you Google like people using assistive technology, there's whole feeds of people showing you how they do their shopping or go about their day-to-day using assistive tools. There's two really good playlists I'd recommend. One is from Access Lab, that's AXESS Lab, and it's called People with Disabilities Using Technology. And there's another one from Tetralogical called Browsing with Assistive Technology. I think people often think accessibility is just about screen readers, but the Access Lab playlist has all sorts of different sorts of assistive tools like eye tracking and adapted gaming controllers, things like that. So yeah, you know, if you're just starting out, I think that's a really good place to start.
Absolutely. Yes.
Another thing I'd recommend if you're starting out is don't just follow accessibility specialists and advocates. Follow people with disabilities on social media and read their stuff. Is there anything you'd recommend? Anything you've looked at along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely sort of following disabled people, follow people who talk about their kind of experience of using the web and stuff. I really like the A11Y project. I don't even know how active it still is, actually. I haven't looked at it kind of recently, but I used to find that super helpful as a kind of way of just getting yourself familiarized with this as a subject matter. Tetralogical's blog, I think, is really good, really helpful. yeah, I think there's so much now for people to choose from. It's kind of inexcusable not to be more knowledgeable about this stuff. I said it. I went and said it.
Very opinionated. I was going to ask you, I heard GDS had a lab where you could try out assistive tools. Was that when you were there, and did you get to try it?
It was when I was there. Yeah, we had a empathy lab, which I believe there's a bit of controversy now around empathy labs as a thing, which I completely understand. Which is that it's very difficult to build empathy with disabled people just by kind of trying out the tools. You're not necessarily a sort of realistic user of these things. It's not really the right. It certainly shouldn't be the only way that we go about trying to understand the experience of our disabled users and things. But yeah, we did have one, and it was relatively helpful for just kind of looking at our content and our components and things on, and just understanding. It can be quite helpful, I think, for catching just like surface level issues and things that you might not know if you're just using your own laptop and your own software.
Yeah, it'd be useful to having, because most of us use Macs to design, and then the two most popular screen readers, JAWS and NVDA, are Windows only. So having a Windows machine, we were kind of lucky at Lloyd's, even though we complained about having to run two computers. It meant you could actually have all the Windows assistive tools and, copies of those. But yeah, I mean, the way someone who's blind uses a screen reader versus how I use a screen reader, when you watch someone, you're like, oh, okay, I use it in a very fundamental, very basic sort of checkbox sort of a way. That's not how it's actually used day to day by someone. So yeah, it's worth bearing that in mind.
And also the speed with which some people can listen to, like, it blows my mind. Oh, sorry, I just threw my microphone over in case anybody heard a noise then. It honestly, like, if you have ever kind of listened to somebody who uses a screen reader a lot, listening to kind of content on the web, I guess you must just get used to it, but I can't, it's completely incoherent to me. So it's a really kind of interesting experience.
I can't even hear the words, like when I use a screen reader, I go into the settings to start with and slow it right down so I can understand everything. And even then I'm pausing it all the time and running over things, but it's just like, woo, like, wow.
Yeah.
I guess it's just a different way of browsing, and it's, if that's your preference, that's what you get used to. Anyway, moving on. Next part of my biology lesson on understanding humans, which is just a bit of a reach here. My next thing, getting on board with accessibility in a design system is obviously agreeing on a standard. If you've got no standards in place, it's hard for anyone what to work towards and what they're aiming for, and how can you hope to enforce it. So my next recommendation would always be get your engineering leads, designers, and product people to agree on a standard. If we're at school, or if we were a school, I think this would probably be at the point where we get an Ofsted inspection of our standards, Amy. What Ofsted rating do you think our podcast would get?
Very poor, I would say. What do you think?
Chaotic, mediocre,
lax discipline.
If you're not from the UK, Ofsted is a government body that periodically visits your school and strikes the fear of God into all the staff who have to give their lessons in front of Ofsted inspectors, and then they give your school a rating or a standard. Anyway, moving right along. So the main industry standard we follow is obviously WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. As someone who worked in government, I imagine WCAG is something you are very familiar with. How did you find getting on board with WCAG? It is a pretty large and complex read.
It is. Needs a bit of content design, I would say, if I can say such a thing. I think nowadays, actually, there's a lot of helpful kind of open source projects and interpretations of WCAG, which can make it a lot more penetrable, I think, for people. I mean, it certainly could be worse, but I definitely think it could be better too. It could be made clearer. And I know that there are some points in it that kind of just repeatedly cause confusion. So I remember I think it was WCAG 2.1 when they introduced the non-text element contrast. I don't know if I'm making that up, but it took us quite a long time to get to grips with what exactly that meant, what counted as a non-text element, or like a decorative what was decorative and what was non-decorative. So icons and things, you know, it was, yeah. So I think it could be clearer, but I also think it's come a long way even since I was first introduced to it. I think that they have done some work to try and make it a bit clearer, but that, yeah, it still probably could improve. What do you think? Is that very unfair of me?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I've had these lengthy debates with other accessibility specialists where we're going backwards and forth over some criteria. Some of the 2.2 stuff around target size, the explainers just seem to contradict each other. So, you know, it's a pretty difficult thing to get on board with, even as someone that knows a bit about accessibility. As you said, there's some really useful open source projects that have rewritten the whole of WCAG in plain language. So if you Google something like WCAG in a language I understand, you know, there's loads that pop up. Stark, actually, who make the accessibility tools, have a really nice one, which is called WCAG Explained, or, you know, there's quite a few of them out there. I also find ChatGPT quite useful. Like, you know, if you search what WCAG criteria relates to something, to links or whatever, I mean, you'll get a load of foundational stuff like color contrast, but within the list, there'll often be a specific criteria that you can then investigate.
Geri, I've got to ask you, are you in fact ChatGPT? Because I feel like it's come up a few times now, and I'm just wondering, is there some kind of... I've never seen you in the same room as ChatGPT before. I'm just going to say that.
I think I'd be a lot more witty, insightful, and better informed if I was ChatGPT, Amy. So I'll say no.
You're very witty and insightful,
Oh, I'm just circling back around to our chat at this point, just because someone has said, great point about getting the entire organization to agree to a standard. We've also included partners and customers in that decision. Oh, interesting move as well, to ensure everyone has an input and a common understanding. I like that approach, Michael.
Well done, Michael.
So WCAG obviously comes in 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. Most companies aim for a AA standard, which means you meet all the A and AA criteria, and meeting a WCAG AA is generally considered as accessible or at least technically compliant. I think if you're new to WCAG, the best place to start is the PAW principles. Can you tell me what PAW stands for, Amy?
Geri, under normal circumstances, I absolutely could, but with my post-COVID brain, I'm not sure, but let's give it a go.
Go on, just make it up. Or you could just quickly ask ChatGPT.
Pretty open. No, I think it is perceivable, operable. The U always throws me. Understandable.
Yes.
And robust.
Okay, loving it. I found a really nice post actually by Jeremy Keith from last month on the WCAG PAW principles. Came up in my feed. I feel like I've read a million articles on WCAG PAW principles. This post really stood out to me because of its simplicity. Jeremy always has a fresh take on something. I love his blog.
Jezza, I love him.
You know, he was sort of saying in these 4 simple principles will get you far without having to dive too deeply into the rest of WCAG. And he described them as perceivable, so content will be legible regardless of how it is accessed. Operable, core functionality will be available regardless of how it is accessed. Understandable, so content will make sense, and robust, content and core functionality will still work regardless of how they're accessed. So I kind of think if you measure all your design and code against these 4 principles, it's a really simple thing and you're most of the way there. You know, you can get really bogged down in the semantics, but at the end of the day, most accessibility is just common sense. You know, can this be used by a real human?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the reason that kind of works as a model is it really helps to kind of engage with the spirit of WCAG. I think sometimes we can get very sidetracked and very preoccupied just looking at the kind of pass or failness of the criteria, but actually the kind of point of WCAG is to make things more accessible to more people. And so I think that, you know, understanding the basic principles that underlie it and trying to really follow those, I think that's it. You're right, you know, and Jeremy is right. That's a very good start point.
So native apps, how would you measure native apps? I know WCAG 2 is kind of designed to be technology neutral, but a lot of the criteria assumes the presence of like a user agent, like a browser or a media player, you know, as a means to access web content. content, it's very web centric. If your design system covered native apps, so iOS and Android, how would you go about measuring those?
Oh, just don't cover them. I hate apps.
You heard it
everything on the
here.
web.
If you're covering apps, just
Hate
move on.
it. Just get rid of them. The web is fine for everyone. I don't know. I'm honestly not even going to pretend to be able to answer this question. I know that there is, I don't remember the name of it, but there is an open source project that I think talks about how to apply WCAG to apps. But I wouldn't really know beyond that. I should say my kind of role in a lot of this stuff is my background is content design, really. So when I'm thinking about WCAG and engaging with WCAG in practical work, which I rarely do now because I spend most of my time just telling people it depends as a consultant. But when I am doing kind of content design work, I'm really thinking mostly about kind of language and the principles that apply to content, which don't really change that much between web and apps. But go on, Geri. I'm sure you're going to have some more insight.
That was a very long-winded way of saying you don't know.
Don't know.
There is a really good open source project. It's called the Mobile Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it takes WCAG criteria and relates it back to native. So I quite like that. I've been digging into that quite a lot. You've obviously got Apple's PIG Human Interface Guidelines, Google Materials, so the Android developer docs. For me, a lot of it's just down to common sense. Things like, as a human typically interacting with a screen, is the hit area large enough for my finger rather than it being a certain pixel size? So yeah, a lot of it for me is common sense, but yeah, I guess they're the main, iOS and Android standards.
Yeah. Do you think, just as a quick aside here, do you think Apple missed a trick by not calling it the Human UI Guidelines and say that they could initialize it as HUG?
Ah, I didn't think about that. Or HUG.
Yeah, I know. I sort of conveniently removed the I for myself there. But,
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, just an idea for you, Tim.
All over the acronyms or whatever they're called, initialisms.
Yes.
Oh dear, I feel like we've done a bit of a deep dive into standards. Maybe I'll move on. The last thing in this section, which is turning to a very long and slightly tangenty biology lesson on understanding humans. The third and final point in the section on starting out in accessibility in your design system is to help get your consumers on board. It's all very well having these standards, but you need to then educate your consuming teams on how to use and apply them. What are some of the ways you've got teams on board, with accessibility to use your beautifully crafted design system components to build accessible products?
I mean, again, I will say I haven't necessarily been the person kind of at the forefront of doing that work, but I have been really lucky to work with some amazing accessibility advocates in the course of my work who I've seen do some really interesting things. So one of the things that's always I remember is that we did a piece of work to basically test the functionality and accessibility of a bunch of new components when I was working on the GovUK design system. And so in order to do that, we built a fake but very realistic service based on a real government service, which is apply for a temporary event notice, which is something that, this is very boring, but something that landlords and venue owners need to apply for if they're going to extend their opening hours to host an event. So there is a real service that actually exists, but most of it is done through paper form. And so we built a digital version of that service and then tested it with people, including people with disabilities, to basically try and understand how well these components worked in a realistic environment. And we found some really interesting, we got some really interesting kind of results and insights by doing that. And one of the things that was really nice when I was working on that design system is that GDS has this very strong culture of kind of working in the open. So we did a lot of show and tells and presentations and things to communicate that work and to show people like videos and things of people kind of using the components and using the projects, which I think helped. And the other thing that stands out to me is when I was working at Babylon Health, I worked with a guy called Fred Warburton, who is, at the time that I joined, he was a studio manager. And at the end of his time at Babylon, he was head of accessibility and design systems, I believe, because he while he was working at Babylon, discovered that he had a degenerative eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa. And he was pretty young, I think he was like 25 or something when he found this out. And as a result of that, kind of very quickly had to learn a lot about accessibility, became very passionate about it, and started to work very closely with the design system team to make sure that what we were producing was accessible. And he put a lot of emphasis on training within the organization. So running kind of training on accessibility for developers, accessibility for designers, accessibility for content people, and also kind of working with senior leaders and stuff as well to help kind of raise awareness. And that seemed to be really, really effective, like, because it was giving people the tools to use, you know, the knowledge to use the tools that we were giving them in a practical way, and not just saying, you know, these components have accessibility baked in. They're accessible out of the box. It was actually helping them to learn how to apply these things.
Wow, what a fantastic, amazing opportunity to be able. I mean, not everyone's sort of in that situation with such an engaged organization. So yeah, you've been lucky to work with some great people. Okay, so I think we're done with all that technical crapola, and we've got a very poor Ofsted rating. So let's
move on. Although while you tee up the next section, Geri, we do have a question in the chat, which is, in your view, where does accessibility responsibility mostly reside in a design team, with the UX or UI designers? I'd say both. What would you say?
Yeah, I'd say both as well. Obviously, you know, once you take all your core components and then they're going out into product, you know, in terms of UX, you're looking for sensible user flows, and then obviously content plays a huge part in that. And then, yeah, from a UI perspective as well, you've obviously got all the contrast stuff, and, you know, yeah, I think both.
Yeah,
maybe a bit more UX than UI. I don't know. It's only because I'm a UX designer.
I don't know. Yeah, I think people are coming at it from different angles, aren't they? Maybe take different have different areas of responsibility within the kind of wider issue. But yeah, I would definitely say both.
That one's settled. Okay, we're off on our monthly field trip, Amy Hupe.
Oh, thank God.
I hope you've got your permission slip signed by your mum.
I always used to forge the signatures on my permission slip.
Yeah, I did.
Not because I wasn't allowed to go, but because my mum and dad were just crap at signing anything. So I always had to just do it on the way.
Oh, dear. Do you want to know where we're going?
Yes, I'd love to, please.
Pack your bags. We're going on a world tour of accessible design systems.
Oh my goodness, just what I've always wanted.
Now, a question I often get asked working in both accessibility and systems is, what are the most accessible systems where we should go for an aspirational example? If anyone listening wants a really good example of a design system that is knocking it out of the park on the accessibility front, who would you recommend they look at?
Oh, you know who I'm going to bloody say, don't you?
Are you sponsored?
I'm not non-spon. It's not SponCon. No, I'm not sponsored. For me, the one that I can always talk about or refer to is the GovUK design system, of course. I talk about it far too much, and it is partly because working at GDS is a little bit like joining a cult. But it also, you know, just I've never ever worked somewhere like that where the emphasis on accessibility was so part of the culture and so kind of supported by everybody there. So I count myself kind of really lucky to have been able to work in that kind of environment, and I think it really shows in the design system. I think that there's a huge, you know, having written a lot of the documentation, which is really the easy bit because you're just kind of writing about other people's work and then going, oh, look what I did, when you didn't really do any of it. But working on the documentation, you know, obviously I had to document a lot of the accessibility testing and principles and rationale that had gone into component design, and just the care taken and the kind of thought that went into it is incredible, and I think has been made very open for people to be able to engage with and access and understand. So that's my number one, I think.
As someone who has stolen a lot of your documentation and passed it off as my own, I can say it's first rate. I'd sometimes think, oh, that's well written, and then I'd realised it wasn't actually me that wrote it to start with.
To be honest, at this point, it's probably not even me that wrote it either, because I haven't worked there for 4 years now, so it's probably the content designer now is somebody called Calvin Lau, I believe. if he's still there, and he's done an incredible amount of work. So yeah, all that documentation is better than when I worked on it. But let's say I did it anyway. He's not here. Not here, are you, Calvin?
Someone, it was Chris Donner, who's the systems lead at Bayer. He recently posted this on Twitter and said, what design systems would you say are the gold standard for accessibility? Obviously, everyone pitched in with GDS, Government Digital Service. Other ones on the list, the US Government Web Design System and the Australia one as well. Good.
Oh, the Aussie one, they defunded it, didn't they? It's such a shame because that was actually an amazing design system.
IBM Carbon pops up quite a lot. I've always thought that was pretty decent. Adobe Spectrum, Atlassian as well. And there was quite a few others in the thread that I'd never actually heard of that I had a good poke through. So
Atlassian surprises me, and no shade on Atlassian. Well, actually, what I'm about to say is not very nice. But I actually don't know. I've never done accessibility testing or assessment or analysis on Atlassian's products, but I do find them sometimes lacking in intuitiveness to use. So I'd be surprised to learn that. But they do have a very good design system team, so maybe I'm wrong.
We just had a question in the tab, which could just take up the whole rest of the episode, which is what tool do you use to audit components, and do you evaluate every criteria? Milena, if you want to drop me a message afterwards, I'll come back to you with all this information, but I feel like this could just take up a lot of our time. And as we have 15 minutes left, I might move on. The next thing I was going to ask was actually something that I've taken from ChatGPT. I'm so embarrassed now.
Taken from ChatGPT, so you say.
So I'm just going to move on and just not even go there because
I want you to tell us, Geri. We want to know.
Well, no, I asked ChatGPT. It's like I've got no freaking mates, Amy. I asked ChatGPT, what is the most accessible design system? And guess what popped up?
Tell me.
Google Material.
Oh, fuck off. No, sorry, we can't swear on this. Oh, no. I don't believe you. No, what are you talking about, ChatGPT?
Oh, anyway, let's move on from there. When I asked Google what the most accessible design system was, guess what the first thing to pop up was?
Google.
Yeah, if I ask Google.
Did they not say
no, they didn't say Google.
They didn't say themselves.
Well, I mean, this might be all to do with my search history and everything in my browser, but when I said what is the most accessible design system, the first thing to pop up was actually a Zero Height blog post titled Top 5 Design Systems with Great Accessibility Documentation.
Ah, lovely.
Knocking it out of the park there with your SEO comms team.
Well done, Zero Height.
I'll paste that into the chat to save Kat searching for
Smashed it. Is it worth us just I know we are light on time, but is it worth us just very briefly explaining? Because I feel like we've just made some sort of implicit references there to Google Material and why we don't like that being named as the most accessible. But I'm thinking maybe everybody listening doesn't know why we're saying these things. And maybe it's just worth a brief mention of, well, we could talk about text input gate. I think that's probably the most relevant thing to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the iterations of Material have really beautifully crafted documentation sites, which I think designers get quite seduced by. And, digging into Android's docs, there's things I'm really on board with. They specify things like a larger target hit area than WCAG and HIG. But yeah, as you say, I can't get past the damage their first iteration of text input fields left on the internet. If you read into their history, they were released pretty carelessly with very little user research.
And they removed the borders, didn't they, around text input?
Did.
So it was just it was a line to write onto rather than a box to input text into. And it just caused a lot of copycat text inputs, which we still see haunting the web today. And B, it didn't prove to be particularly intuitive or accessible, did it? And they ended up reversing that design decision. But as you say, it was originally released without really any kind of rationale or any evidence that it was a good thing to do.
To quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I think even though they've moved on, they've learned and improved, they have to own this legacy. And as a bit of a UX purist, I don't think I'll ever get past this.
No, I don't think
Spicy
so
hot take.
No, we're like spicy hot take from me too. What I will just mention is that Ruben has commented in the chat. in reference to your Zero Heights blog being the top 5, being the top 5. It just says history-based result. So sorry to burst your bubble, SEO specialist at Zero Height, but we're not buying it.
Oh, goodness me. Okay, let's move on. I was going to call this next section law, but that sounded a bit grown up for school. So instead I'm calling it detention, or what happens when you don't follow the rules. Did you ever get a detention at school, Amy?
You won't be surprised to hear that, yes, I did, Geri. I actually didn't get too many, but unsurprisingly, the couple that I did get were both in Mr. Jones's biology class. Mr. Jones was a teacher who was also a friend of my older sister, and that was far too much for my adolescent brain to cope with. Just the kind of excitement, embarrassment, just absolutely overwhelmed by that. So me and my friend JJ, hi JJ if you're listening, which you won't be because you don't work in design systems, we used to be very, very disruptive in his class, and I think one day he just got absolutely fed up with it. Told me that he was going to tell my sister what I was doing in front of the whole class, so that was mortifying, and then gave us both a detention.
Okay.
How about you?
Ooh. Oh,
never got one.
No, looking back to junior Geri, I was really clever. I found out in year 7 the school kept a copy of all the notes that your parents wrote to the school. So the first note my mum wrote, I tore up and I rewrote it myself. And then it gave me license to skip school and all school sports day by writing my own notes. So I tended to just write myself out of stuff that I didn't want to do.
Wow.
Shocking,
well done,
isn't it?
Shocking.
Oh. Anyway, just wanted to touch on the laws and standards. I think if you're working in a design system, you're the upholder of standards, and you need a bit of an understanding of accessibility law. Senior stakeholders will come to you with queries about this because everyone is worried about the financial penalties that come with being sued. We've obviously talked about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the US. Do you know which law relates to accessibility in the UK?
Oh my God. Is it the mobile and web applications, or is that just as a guideline? The Equalities Act?
Yes, the UK Equality Act. It's kind of a sucky act, though, because it's really vague and unmeasurable. It doesn't quote a technical standard. It says that your product or service must make reasonable adjustments so disabled people can use them. And, that's why there's never any legal action that, makes it to court in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in Europe, there's this new European Accessibility Act, which comes into play in June 2025. Is this on your radar?
It's not really, only that I read it in your notes.
Okay. If you're a business that's trading in Europe, it's kind of a big thing at the moment. It's the first sort of big act that focuses on private sector organizations, and it covers websites and apps for sectors like banking and e-commerce. Basically, I'm not a lawyer, but my stare is if you're only in my spare time when I'm not being ChatGPT.
I see.
My stare on this is if you're technically compliant to a WCAG AA, you've got accessibility statements on products that are setting out your commitment to accessibility, and you're giving consumers a way to feedback. You're kind of ticking most boxes here. But I feel like this is an act that will take a lot of companies by surprise who are trading in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've really bored you with that one. Okay, that's the school bell. It looks like lunchtime detention is over.
Oh, yay. I'm not bored. I told you I've got resting concentration face, and it just makes me look bored, but that's when I'm tuned in, Geri.
Resting UX face. Okay, we're running out of time, so you can choose between the last 2 sections. One is called Beef with the School Canteen, and the other one is called Science Class, the Future of Accessibility in Design Systems. Which one do you want?
Can't believe you gave me a choice of those two and you led with beef with the school canteen. Of course I'm choosing that. Come on, let's do both. I think we can do both.
No, we haven't got time to do both. Beef with the school canteen. Oh my gosh. You're not a vegetarian, are you?
No.
I was meaning you've got beef with this rather than let's eat some cow.
You've watched me eat a burger.
Oh, I have. Yeah, sorry.
And chicken wings.
Oh, I'm glad you chose this one because it's just a load of questions for you about things you have beef with. Okay, let's go. What is the
Good.
least accessible of all design system components?
Oh God, there's so many to choose from, isn't there? Ones that immediately come to my mind: drop down / selects, tooltips, modals, hate modals, accordions. Those are my pet peeves. Carousels, just get rid of them.
The Geri design system has no tooltips or accordions, FYI, if you want to hire me. Okay. Is there a design trend you have beef with because it's terrible for accessibility?
Oh, I think we're going too far with animation. I think there's too much and we're not doing it very well. I think all this just this animation on scroll and all that stuff that moves everything about, you sometimes moves important elements about on the page. Stop it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's not big and it's not clever.
Sensible advice. Okay, moving on. Is there an accessibility guideline or standard you have beef with because it's frustrating to implement?
Oh, no. No, can't think of one. Probably, but not one I've ever had to worry about implementing. What do you must have an interesting one.
I've got loads.
Name one.
The main one for me is disabled states. They don't have to be color compliant. So regardless of how faint the text is, they still pass automated testing. So I have beef with those.
Yeah.
Okay, last bit of beef before we move on.
Okay.
What accessibility myth or misconception do you encounter most often and why does it annoy you?
Oh, I think something about seeing disabled people as these kind of one-dimensional people with a set of criteria that you can pass or fail, and not, rounded humans with intersectional problems and barriers that we have to think about, and see kind of, thinking about disabled people as accessibility issues and people with access needs, and normally just screen reader users is, I think just a lack of knowledge and a dehumanization of disabled people in web accessibility. What do you think?
I completely agree. I guess for me, my biggest beef is the whole no disabled person uses our product. And 16% of the world has a disability or impairment. If no one is using your product, it's probably because the user experience sucks for them and you've given it no consideration. So that's why no one's using your product, not because no one will use your product if it's designed properly.
Heard it here first.
Whew, okay, I feel like that's enough beef for one afternoon.
Yes.
Let me go on to my closing thoughts. I was sort of thinking of Jerry Springer was closing thoughts. I've never made that connection before. So my closing thoughts are: if you're tasked with accessibility in a design system, don't panic. There are hundreds of free resources online that can help. Learn how disabled people and people with different access needs use the web. Familiarize yourself with laws and standards around accessibility, and go forth and spread the good news of accessible and inclusive design using your design system as a hub. So there we go.
Lovely closing thoughts.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes. We've just got time for, we were going to have an end of term disco where, everyone did the Running Man and you got to snog that cute boy from year 7. But unfortunately, we still have some overhang from the Tory government. So instead of a disco, we have an end of term pop quiz.
Oh, God.
The sticker is, it's covering all episodes. Are you ready?
Yes.
Name the third member of this iconic design systems boy band. Jason, jQuery, and...
Mark Down.
Woo!
Yes. Oh, my God. Amazing question.
If you were a design system, which one would it be and why?
Oh my God, is there a correct answer for this? I'd probably be Google because I do things without thinking. I'd be Material UI. I do careless things without thinking and then fail to apologize adequately for them afterwards.
Okay, next question. If you want to learn anything about design systems, whose blog should you read?
Mine. No. Nathan Curtis.
Of course, Nathan Curtis. I feel like he's been our unofficial sponsor. Basically,
Yeah.
every single episode we've done has just been read this Nathan Curtis episode rather than listening to this. And my final question. In every episode, I've used the phrase "with my accessibility hat on." What colour is my accessibility hat?
Geri, I think it's red.
I don't know. I think it changes colour, so it always has at least a 3:1 contrast ratio against the background.
Oh, for goodness sake. So your question was what colour is it? And your answer is no specific colour. Great. Can't help but think you set me up for a 4.
Okay, so for some inexplicable reason, our quizzes all end with a question about capybaras. So for this last one, I did some extensive research. I read articles on Bored Panda and BuzzFeed, which I think were made by AI. Some of them were like the equivalent of a photo of a person with 3 arms. So this capybara thing started with you, so I think it needs to finish with you. So the final question is, what 3 things do you have in common with capybaras?
Oh, for goodness sake. I am semi-aquatic. I can hold my breath underwater for 5 minutes. Bet you didn't know that about me. I am... Oh my God. I have no prey, apart from a jaguar, which would probably eat me. And I weigh more than you.
Okay, this is what I came up with based on my extensive research.
Okay.
You both like spas. Some zoos and parks in Japan provide special hot springs for the capybara to relax in during winter, and I know you're quite partial to a spa.
I am partial to a spa, Geri.
Odd friendships. Capybaras are known for forming unusual friendships and have been seen bonding with cats, ducks, monkeys, and tortoises. Now, you do accumulate random mates. I mean, I am including myself in this.
I do. I'm a weirdo magnet, but I love it. I love it.
Okay, the last one. I think this is where the AI kicked in. Capybaras are apparently messy eaters, and I've never met anyone who spills food and drink with quite the veracity that you do.
It's Billy Elliot.
Yeah,
that's what they call me.
You're down with the capybara.
I am down with the capybara. I don't like spit, dribble food out my mouth or anything. I just like it's between the plate and the mouth. That's where I lose it most of the time.
Yeah. Always seem to be wearing some sort of white outfit that's just crying out for a stain as well. Own worst enemy. That's us done. We just need to give each other a mark.
I think you should have an A star for the last episode, Geri. Your first ever A star with commendation.
I think you should have an A star too, Amy, because you've had COVID. You couldn't string a sentence together, but you've done incredibly well. Considering
you couldn't string a sentence together, and that didn't change.
More eloquent in this episode than you have in some of the others, which you've made no comment about. So I'm very impressed.
Okay, thank you for that strange compliment.
Okay, we're at the end.
Oh my God.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Zero Hype for letting us make this. It has been a monthly highlight of mine, and I have genuinely enjoyed researching stuff, and I've learnt a lot.
Me too. Thank you so much, Zero Hype. Thank you, Geri. It's been such a pleasure. We should start our own podcast after this.
We definitely should. Yeah, we just need someone to do all the post-production and editing and everything for free if anyone wants to volunteer.
I know someone. Oh, no, not for free. Not for free. But,
okay. No, I wouldn't expect anyone to do anything for free,
No.
Okay, let's take it offline. Thank you for joining us, people. It's been beautiful.